how Pandora talks to you, how you see the world, and how you recognize what's going on in the psyche of others, not so that you can, other than just appreciate the force of this anomaly ego that we have evolved at this time in our social evolution. So you would say, what is the difference between the ordinary ego and the Pandora anomaly? Prior to the nuclear age, prior to that, we were still very tribal. We had not yet entered the age of individualism. We hadn't gone there yet. And that's something important to understand, because at that point, if we were studying the ego, it would be very much a product of identity, very much a product of the superficials of the first, second, and third chakra. It would be so much based on your nationality, on your ethnic heritage, on the stuff you had, on on your collective psychic myths that were held by the tribe. We Turks, we Greeks, we Irish. It would be we Italians. You would hold collective mythologies that would very much define your base of power. So that the idea of individuating, of breaking away from this group and becoming what you might think of today as a global persona would have been unthinkable. That archetype had yet to evolve. There was it was prior to World War II. Such a concept had not yet even dropped, was not yet animated within the collective. Are you kidding? If you said to someone, I am a global person, those two words never met. Who said global? Who even used that word prior to World War II? They said the word globe. I challenge you to find the word global and person in the same sentence prior to World War II. But entering the nuclear age was this, I need you to come up here to the top floor of the building where you are in cosmic thought. You are in the cosmic domain of the human experience, where you are unattached to anything personal. You are able to kind of read the evolutionary patterns of what is evolving in the human experience. And you witness entering the nuclear domain. A domain that is going to transition into a Aquarian thinking. You enter into what humanity will recognize as a different domain of power. A power that is solar. A power that goes from fossil, earth-based, to solar-based. We are shifting from the speed of dirt to the speed of the sun. From the power of dirt How fast does Earth grow food? One day at a time. To the speed at which light moves. Follow what I'm saying. The slowness at which the earth can produce change, to the speed at which light produces change. From earth fossil to solar light. That is what happened during the Manhattan Project, we figured out how to transition from coal, from earth power to solar. That same transition happened in our cell tissue instantly when Oppenheimer and his crew cracked this code. Everything shifted. And along with that, the door went into the nuclear solar part of ourselves, into the solar part of our collective unconscious, which to that time was being held under the earth, metaphorically speaking, under the earth, so that we could access our collective only at earth power, only through the forest at night, so to speak, only through fairy tales, only if through tribal stories, only through Little Red Riding Hood, only through Hans Christian Andersen, only through myths and stories that the tribe passed down about how we human beings behaved. Through tribal tales in which we all recognized, and what did these tales always tell us? Through tales of knights and princesses, and tales of the big bad wolf, and tales of witches and warlocks and things like this, and monsters. But they were essentially all tales of the 10 Commandments incarnated. They were tales of good and evil. They were tales of what's right and wrong. They were tales, all of them. They were tales of the collective unconscious and how to behave within a tribe. They were all of them archetypal. The great Greek dramas. They were tales of the power, look at this, the power up here, the power that's up there, and how we engage with it. The power of the gods, and how we engage with it within a tribe that's called religion, and how we engage with it. In entering the nuclear age, and I need you to hear this in such a way that you're not thinking of the bomb. The bomb is one manifestation. I need you to come up here and think of it as solar. So here's the bomb down here, and up here it's this it's the speed of sun. It's the speed of light. And entering the age of the speed of light, we shifted into the age of light, the age of the soul, solar, S-O-U-L-A-R. we entered into an age of higher consciousness. We entered the age of the self. It was time for the inner self, for us to know the inner self, for the solar, for our solar, S-O-U-L-A-R technology. Okay? Just think of that. And that is, the power of the soul is like a personal nuclear reactor. Okay? It's, remember one of the mystical laws, what is in one is in the whole. Okay. Okay, now, this is going to be like teaching you in a hologram. So that you're in the center of a hologram. I'm going to teach you here, then we're going to bounce here, then we're going to bounce here, then we're going to bounce here, but it's all in the same thing, okay? So I can no longer teach in a linear way. So you're going to have to hold on, right? We got that agreement? Okay. So we enter into this time of light. This also signals the age in which each soul will be instructed to study the power of its own light. Its own light. Its own light. Okay. Number 3. We could call this, I mean, this is if we go a little further on this, like this analogy of this, of thinking of this in this way, this is heightening an entirely different view of the responsibility, the soul's ability to respond, the demand to become conscious. I'm going to give you a kind of a yet another symbolic, going back to war. I told you war is the great change agent. And I said, like Prometheus stealing the fire and grabbed the fire from Zeus, this is how we entered the nuclear age under the myth of Pandora. And in stealing the fire, we enter the age, the nuclear age, in shadow. And we enter, if you can imagine, and Oppenheimer later, of course, nearly went insane. I am death, he declared. And I have looked at death, and it is I. It is me. I am death, the angel of death. He realized what he had done, but all too late. Imagine that the splitting of the atom was like an act on a black altar. Because it was done, we entered with the intention to kill. Instead of with the intention to bring light to the earth. Now, following law, following the Tao, because that light was immediately thrown to the dark side, the light had to throw light immediately to the light side. Are you following? So it necessitated the explosion of what we would call the consciousness movement. It necessitated that an appetite for inner growth, spirituality, the spirit, the soul, be activated, animated, almost in an explosion a nuclear explosion of equal proportion. A consciousness explosion, which would be the 60s, okay? That a consciousness, so these are the events that happened in the late 50s and 60s that were probably supremely calculated to unlock and unleash Pandora on a grand scale. Because this is the difference between the tribal ego. I don't want to say the word because. The difference between the tribal ego and now the call toward individuation. The call toward the individual journey. The capacity for the power of tribal choice and individual choice is something we need to discuss. Tribal choice evolves very, very slowly. It evolves at the pace of tradition. Traditions make tribal choice. One person breaking away. The individual breaks away and begins the journey of self-discovery, selfhood. But the first place people went was in their interior Pandora's box. The first place, I have to say this again, there's so much to say. Let me do this again. Okay. All right, I'll do it this way. I'm sorry to be so confused. I have 18 things coming at me at once that want to come out, and they're vying for time. Let's do it this way. What happened in the 60s, what accommodated this whole process of evolution, is first the spiritual movement. The spiritual movement, the psychological movement, the humanistic movement, all of the things that happened in the 60s that allowed a sense, the individual movement to begin to take shape. That provided the society, that provided the society with a vocabulary that was never available before. And that was the vocabulary of the psyche and the soul. That was never available to the collective, to the tribe, prior to World War II. The significance here that has to also be noted is that what opened up first in the 1960s and then into the 70s was as we began to piece together the vocabulary of the psyche and the soul. The first place we wanted to go when we turned around and said, what is this place behind our eyes, was not into exploring, neutrally, what's the collective? The first place we wanted to go was into our wounds. The first place we wanted to go was into our Pandora's box. The first place we wanted to go was into our wounded child, was into our most vulnerable place. That was the first place we wanted to go. Was into our victim, into our wounded child, into the weakest, most vulnerable part of ourselves. The second place is that we began to ask questions that were previously never encouraged or introduced. And those questions were that they had previously been kind of restricted to monasteries. Wait a minute. I need to go back to that in a second. Something we were talking about earlier. For example, what purpose do I have? I, not the tribe, not my people. What does God want of me? For what reason did God give me life? Is this the only religion? What else is out there? The unthinkable began to happen in the 60s and then picked up momentum as we got to the 70s. And that's that people started to withdraw from the tribal religion in order to pursue their own spiritual path. And they did this because they began to sense an inner spirit. They wanted to know about their inner spirit. They were pursuing something. The third thing that happened, and these three wires came together. These were the wires that began to form Pandora. The third was this idea that you could heal yourself, that somehow you created your own reality. This notion that you participated in the creation of your reality was a brand new concept, brand new, off the wall. And it gave birth to a level of choice, a permission to make choices that the tribe prior to World War II would have never allowed the individual to make. Never. But now you create your own reality. This was like personal cocaine. I create my reality. And it became interpreted on the first floor as opposed to the mystical principle that it is. Instead of grappling with it and being able to comprehend it as a mystical truth, it became reduced to cheap street change and permission to do whatever you want to do. And that's how people just say, I create I need. And now the inner self got hold of this. And now we have a real good partnership beginning to form. And now let's add another element, which is this idea of inner guidance. You get it on the inner. Ooh, you get it on it. Where'd you get that? I got it on the inner. The idea of intuition. Let's introduce that about this time. That there is this thing called intuition. And you get guidance on the inner. Mixed with, this is the alchemy that began to form Pandora. Add a dash of wounds, a dash of intuition, a lot of wounds. It's like 50% wounds. And then you have this sense that what this gives you, and then of course it's healing. What do I need to do to heal? Call this your spiritual path. Make yourself your spiritual path, which is what people ended up doing. And then call your ego, your inner guidance here. Add to it this permission to do whatever you want because you create your own reality. And from this was formed the first wave of how people understood health. Well, didn't we create this? I know I created this. I know I created this. Illness comes from negativity. And illness comes from health. Blah, 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 blah. Are you getting a feel for where this Pandora thing comes from? That it's far more than the tribal ego that raised your parents and your grandparents. This is a mega force, a bubble in which the modern person lives. Now, I have to go back to something I was talking about, and I got sideswiped because I was trying to make notes for this in my head simultaneously, and I'm not really able to keep 4 tracks going on at the same time. So I'll get back to this in a minute. What I wanted to add was that there were cooperating forces that were helping set the stage for the emergence of this spiritual era. And I need to point that out. In the late 50s and in the 60s. In the late 50s, 60s, sacred scrolls were discovered around in Palestine, the Nag Hammadi and the Dead Sea. Israel came into being in the late 40s. So it would be the end of the diaspora. Okay. And then Vatican II was held. The council brought together by Pope John the 23rd. And the significance there is that in that council, they said the doors of the church were open. There's these rotting old doors. But it was a big deal because a quality of thought and theology, a quality of thinking, was opened up at the same time that flows of Eastern religion were coming into the country. And Catholics would not have felt safe to start reading about other religions if Vatican II had not happened. They would have been terrified to go near other teachings, had a relaxation, a more liberal energy not happened in the church. So the timing, the kind of Mertonist timing that happened, laid the groundwork on a cosmic level for individuals to begin to pursue a very profound soul language that we began to outfit our soul with in the world behind our eyes. At the same time, the work of Carl Jung was becoming available. The work of archetypes, in the work of therapists, Maslow, the work of therapists on the wounded child was becoming available, okay? At the same time, television had become mainstream by the 60s. What also had become mainstream by the 60s was, and the 50s and the 60s, was we were, and not someone like Jennifer, but the Americans following World War II were the only ones to ever have been raised with television, ever. And the impact of that is that the first wave, which would have been in the 50s and then the 60s, was to encounter, and this is very important to understand, was to encounter the archetype of the perfect family. You had the archetype of Leave It to Beaver and My Three Sons and Donna Reed, who used to go to bed with pearls on. And then you were introduced to, at the same time that the collective in the U.S. was beginning to investigate the wounded child, Walt Disney introduces the magical child. So you have all these children, and Mary Poppins, this magical nanny with magical children. So you have this image and Lassie and all these perfect role model parents with endless patience and perfect little houses. And these kids come home and they watch this with ears on and all these perfect little fantasy. And this archetype of the magical child begins to imprint as the American public creates a vocabulary of, here's a languaging, ideal American family. The perfect, perfect, perfect. And a language and a whole concept of being entitled to this begins to seep in. While waking up while being juxtaposed to the waking up of the feminist, the wounds of the female. So you have real polar opposites coming up while the individual is waking up and going into the collective, going into his or her Pandora box. Now this is, and the society itself is individuating during the 60s, going into the era of feminism, civil rights, the right to speak up. But what was the right that was emphasized in the 60s was the right of the wound. It was the decade of the wound, the decade that gave the wound entitlements and gave the wound power. You have to understand how much that shaped the politics and power and how much that gave authority to our collective and gave the notion here of the individual with the opposing image of perfection and magic, that somehow everyone in this country is not just entitled to a house, but to a perfect childhood. And that is the opposing child. That's the opposing child, that the magical child goes with the wounded child. And that those two children vie for space in the American psyche. The magical and the wounded. And these two children fight for space in the participation of the creation of Pandora. This is part of Pandora. So that when, and I wondered why through the years so many people identify with the wounded child. And it's because underneath it, they have a magical child fantasy. That they shoulda, woulda, coulda had a magical childhood. That their parents were so negligent, neglectful. Oh my God. And even if they weren't, even if they were as loving as they could be, it simply wasn't enough. Because they didn't have a Disney castle. Now, some parents were brutal. They were horrible. They were just horrible. And I know that. So I put them in this category. Those were the wretched people who should probably never have kids in the first place, but they did, and there it is. And God has always, those kinds of parents have always been and always will be. But there is this magical wounded child duality that is an anomaly of our time. And that's part of the Pandora, formation of the Pandora. And Pandora thrives on these two. Now, how many of you can relate to what I'm talking about? Okay, so now you're beginning to see how this comes about. And how many of you does your magical child exaggerate, create your fantasies that you should have had a better childhood and it was taken away from you? Is it a lie? Does your magical child lie to you? Just make up things? Come on, talk to me. This is how you identify because magical children make up things. They tell you that, come on, you shoulda, woulda, coulda. Are you talking to me or not? Are you afraid if you talk about your magical child it'll go away? Is that what kind of stunt you're pulling here? What?
A magical child that...
Oh, come on.
I think maybe... Oh, thanks.
Now, don't fold yourself up like this.
It's just a little chilly. I'm wondering if maybe the magical child does not always have to be wounded, because the magical child can also be that source of hope and optimism that gets you through kind of the unexplainable.
But I'm not talking about that, am I?
Well, does your magical child have to be wounded?
No. There's the wounded child and the magical child. These are twins. They're in a partnership. I'm only talking about the magical child now.
Okay. Well, then I and you know what? Honestly, I could have the magical child understanding incorrect, because I thought the magical child was the optimist, had that optimism that
the magical child. Okay, let me then describe this.
I'm sorry,
because
you guys,
no, honey, no. That's what we're all here for. If I could put us all in a hot tub and stark naked, where we could just get that way with each other, we'd really get to the root of this. A Pandora. Remember, I'm talking now about Pandora.
Right.
Okay, and. So the phenomenon of how these two work with Pandora is that the magical child and speaks a certain way. The magical child has an agenda when it comes to Pandora. The magical child and the wounded child have an agenda. And what that is that they work to create this sense that your childhood was that you missed a lot of magic that you were entitled to because of your wounds. And here's an example. Are you with me here? Here's an example. Children who fantasize about their missing parent, and they magicalize that parent. I made that word up. They cast a magic spell over their missing parent. That would have been my perfect parent, and you're my awful parent. That is a magical child, wounded child duo. And that stays in the Pandora ego. Huh? That's speaking to you? Okay. That's a magical child, wounded child. All the magic is over there, and the wound is there, but they need each other. They need each other. So this isn't about the magical child. It's about a particular union. And in that union, this is part of what one uses to build their Pandora ego, which is an ego